All right, how are you guys doing today? Today we are doing a book review, or I guess I should say it's a book list, a recommendation list, and all of the literature we're going to be talking about. It has to do vaguely with this idea we've been introducing in our earlier videos and in our recent videos, specifically about self-referential thinking, metacognition in general, and then this phrase, it's unusual, but we introduce it called recursive awareness. So you don't really hear that phrase said too often. We're taking some liberties by introducing that, and maybe I'm going to put it in my title here. And the idea here is to give you guys a bit of a ledge hold if you want more formal ways to explore some of these ideas. So I don't know. I mean, I know reading is going downhill, and there's a lot of people who don't see a point in it anymore. I have my own arguments about that, and I could probably make another video on that. I think I have made one about just reading, the importance of reading, blah, blah, blah. But this is just for people who still enjoy reading as a way to absorb new ideas, because I know everyone, they read differently. Some people get immersed, some people just like to skim books, but it's not an objective list. These aren't the absolute top books on this idea of self-reference. I mean, the first one, it's a little more obvious. That one might be canon as far as the recursive canon goes, but the rest of these are just my opinions. There are recommendations that I think are interesting and fit together to paint this very unique yet interesting picture when you're trying to get a clearer perspective on all the stuff that I'm talking about. So I do respect all of these authors. And last thing, I guess I'll say this. I got some pretty good feedback on my last video, and I admitted this, sometimes I'm talking and then I just go on and it turns into a little bit of an exposition. So I'm going to try and minimize that for this video. Just present you guys the information as cleanly and as succinctly as possible. I'm just going to give you guys the main information and then hopefully give you a reason to read it or try reading it if it's something that's up your alley. So I think there are 6 or 7, 6 books on this list, and we're just gonna go through them all, and that'll be that. I'll try to make it a pretty simple video. But this first one, you've been staring at it for a minute or two now. This is the obvious one. It's why I have it first, and we even talked about this book in our last video. I mentioned it specifically when it comes to this idea of self-reference and recursion. And in this book, Gödel Escher Bach, Hofstadter, he calls it the eternal golden braid, but he basically takes 3 avenues for explaining this one idea of self-referential systems. And he does that by evoking art. So MC Escher's art, it's actually very fascinating. I would look it up, but I know that'll be a rabbit hole. You can look it up yourself. Just type in MC Escher and you'll probably know who that is, who I'm talking about, once you see his pictures. He also touches on Gödel, which he wrote the mathematical incompleteness theorems, and those are very well known, but they're also a bit controversial, or at least the interpretations of those theorems, they're a bit controversial. But he ties that into this idea of self-reference, and that's part of what's debated is to what degree this incompleteness of math actually proves deeper reliance on self-reference, which I have my own arguments for, and then he even ties it into Bach. And I just think it's a super fascinating, beautifully written. I don't agree with 100% of the stuff that he says, but if you are looking for a more straightforward version of this book, I believe he wrote this after, but I Am a Strange Loop is very, very similar, but he goes more in-depth formally to this idea of how self-reference and self-referential looping applies to consciousness. So that's the first recommendation. Technically 1 and 2. We're just going to consider both of these books as number 1. Next is Wittgenstein. It might be Wittgenstein. I don't know, and that's a little embarrassing, but I haven't taken a class on him or anything. I just have read him kind of individually, independently. But this book, Philosophical Investigations, is when you talk about language and understanding how semantics and the meaning of language arises, this is, I believe, to be a foundational work in that I don't know if there's a work that lays out the recursive nature of language more effectively than he does. But that's really what this book is. He explores how this idea, this domain of language itself, actually emerges as a self-referential web. So words and phrases and syntax, they get their meaning through their reliance on each other. And this reliance, that this web of self-reliance creates, that is the thing that creates coherence in language. And he explores this idea in a super fascinating way, I believe. It is a little bit more dense. It's hard to get into because he has his own certain prose, but I guess all of these authors do. So all of these books are a little bit on the more tedious side, but I guess that's just the nature of the literature on these topics. And there are some good narratives about the idea of recursion too, but this is just, it's meant to be a semi-foundational list. Next, you might be surprised by seeing this actually. Kierkegaard, he's a theologian philosopher technically, but I am very keen, I am very fascinated by the idea of irony actually being a certain instantiation of how self-reference works at a metacognitive level. So if you think about what irony is and what humor is technically, because I think irony, you could argue, is a precursor to humor in general. But what irony is the ability or a sort of self-awareness to a paradoxical situation. I mean, that's as simple as I can put it. He puts it much more elegantly, but what you're doing when you are experiencing irony is it is this sort of ability to perceive a situation, to step out of an immediate situation and then perceive it from a outside perspective. And we talked about this in the last video as well. But that is meta-recursive thinking. And when you become adept or just start to do it more naturally, then you start to notice weird idiosyncrasies about the constraints of certain situations. And that takes the form of paradox in a lot of ways. So he doesn't use that idea of paradox explicitly, but you can tie it into that phenomenon if you read this book. And I think he takes a more philosophical approach as well, but I think it's an unusual pick. But through the lens of all of this stuff we're talking about and all these self-referential ideas, it's a unique twist and it's a unique perspective, I believe. So next, this one you guys might be surprised at. There might be some people that are like, what the hell is Sowell doing on this list? But hear me out. I know some people aren't the biggest fan of Sowell, but this is a great example of using metacognitive thinking or a recursive-based perspective and then applying it to real, practical socioeconomic systems. In this book, I would say it's very ideology-free, so you don't have to worry about it being geared towards a specific way. It's aimed at non-specialists in economics, so it doesn't use economic language and economic jargon to explain how systems of agency work, basically, interactive systems of agency. And I know this, again, is a surprising inclusion, but when you talk about these systems, one way you can see them and think about them is they are feedback loops between both individuals and then group agents. And it explores how these interactions can emerge and then some of the hidden variables, the lurking variables that you don't always consider when you think about economics in general. And then he just gives a super unique perspective that I believe also is ripe for modern integration when you're using the recursive lens. All right, next. Now this one's dense. If you know Heidegger, you're probably sighing right now. But it was hard for me not to include this on the list because it is pretty foundational to how we think about a lot of these things. You know, Being and Time is a very apt title, but anything that talks about and goes into the concept of being and isness is inherently self-referential, and he does it with, I believe, a beautiful prose. It's one that you have to spend some time with, and you have to be okay with spiraling a little bit because some literature is so existentially heavy. It's very difficult to read it casually. So this wouldn't be one of the casual recommendations. I just think it ties really neatly into our idea of axiomatic erosion. No axiom can be fully sustained without breaking down into some form of self-reference. And he says something similar with the whole being can never be fully objectified type thing. So that's a very strong parallel there, and we'll leave it at that. But this was an important one to be on the list. Okay, now last book. This one is my personal favorite, and it is also a very short book, but it is one of the most incredible books that I've ever read, if not the most incredible book. It is, in my view, pure recursive psychology. And I don't even want to explain it too much. I don't want to spoil anything. If I had to recommend one book on this list, it would be this book, Notes from Underground. A lot of people already know Dostoevsky, that they already know his work. He's more famous for, I believe, Crime and Punishment and The Brothers Karamazov and a couple other books. And this one is pretty popular, but it's not as well known to some people because of its length. But I think it is potentially his most powerful work in what it actually succeeds in doing. He manages to depict like the worst case, the nihilist aspect of a recursive mindset in a incredibly visceral way. Like, it is amazing what he's able to do with this book, to the point of the first couple times I read it, I was actually scared. Like, I couldn't believe how clearly he was articulating things that I had no idea could be articulated in that way, especially from a first person perspective. So I resonate heavily. Maybe I'm biased in that way, but I think this is a phenomenal book, and I would recommend it to anyone who's willing to parse through something like this. There's two parts. I think the first part is better, but the second part complements it really nicely, and then it gives a actual narrative to say the monologue that this narrator drags you through for, I don't know, a few chapters. Like I said, it's not that long, but man, it's a something else entirely. And that's it really. I mean, there's one more book here that's Breezery, which, I'm just kidding. If you're talking about a recursive literature, though, it fits in pretty nicely, but it's still in its early stages. So I don't want to throw myself out there with the names of some of these greats. That would be a little audacious. That's a joke. I couldn't help myself. But I'm curious if any of you guys have read these or are familiar with these, or you have your own perspectives on how these tie into this idea of metacognition and recursive thinking in general. I'd be very curious to know. I think everyone has a unique perspective, and there are a lot of these books. Just going through this list, I want to reread them now, because some of them I read quite a while ago, and I think I would get a lot more out of rereading them through spending more time going through these ideas. So I might do that actually. Maybe I'll pick one up right now. But yeah, I just wanted to give you guys a concise, hopefully well-rounded, but unique and not predictable list. The first one, this is Gödel Escher Bach. This one is predictable. I'll give you that. But if you do read any of these, I hope you find them interesting. And like I said, I'd love to know what you guys think. So good luck.